That's so hard. That's
how it's listed in
That's pretty funny.
People do it one day, they do it 1 year.
basically, I read it's like a phone call. And I think it's they're like, well, we do.
Doing okay today?
I'm good.
I'm clicking right on it.
What'd you say?
I'm gonna click on right on it.
Don't do that.
Yeah, for good one.
Okay, just a couple of updates for you guys. I've begun to invite faculty who are chairs of your committees to come and visit us and speak about their ideas about the thesis experience and advice on navigating that successfully and beginning to get commitment. So I'll keep you guys up on that. I'm trying to schedule them either Wednesdays or Fridays so they don't interfere with your Monday progress reports. And then whatever days they pick, I'll move my chalk talk to the other day. So that's in motion. A week from today, Jandina and Alvaro, you guys are up a week from today. So I want to say again that I'm not expecting you guys to prepare anything super special for this, but do prepare enough to create a discussion and give us some feel for how your progress is going, and then maybe concentrate on things that you would like to focus the discussion on. So I really want to emphasize not diverting your attention from the thesis work itself in a major way to prepare for this. Think of them as progress reports and not slick sort of defenses or presentations. So that begins a week from today. What else can I say? Andrew's talking with, I think it's the English department or some sort of a writing entity on campus to see if they're willing to provide editing and writing advice for us. Right now that's still murky. I don't have a feel yet for how comfortable you guys are writing. You may already write well enough to do the thesis. It's not unusual for architects to struggle with writing though, because we tend to self-select for visual kinds of things. So that's kind of happening in the wings. I'll let you know how that firms up, and I don't know how the encounters will happen, but just know that that's kind of boiling in the sidelines.
I know that on the graduate research site, on the FAMU's website, they have a resource for you to use if you need help with writing.
Okay, that might be in addition to what he's doing, so you may have two options there. So that's just kind of an update of some things in the works. Let's see now whether you guys have come across any new questions in your work. Anybody running into anything that would be good to talk about around the table that you think would be applicable to other people? Okay, I want to do a little quick board work on some pieces I want you to have a week from today that you'll be turning in. They'll be drafts, but the more complete they are, the better off you'll be in terms of your confidence in how to create these pieces. And the two pieces I want you to work on are just one of your literature sources. It can be an article, it can be whatever you want the source to be. And you should pick a source you're pretty confident is going to be on your final literature review. So what I'm going to have you do on that element is write one review for a literature source you're confident about. So don't pick one you think's liable to be bumped or trumped by something else. Pick something you're pretty sure is going to be on your list of final literature search and literature review components. And what I want to do, and the other thing, I'm going to talk about the other thing, then we'll do some board work and make sure you're clear what I mean by this. So you're only going to do one. Eventually, you're going to do 3 or 4, however many you want to. Typically, it's 3 to 5. But the reason I'm having you do one is to get your feet wet putting one together. So if you can do one, you'll have some confidence and some sense for how to proceed with the other ones. And so this is just kind of an icebreaker to get you started with the treatment that happens with these literature reviews. Second is a precedent. I want you to find a precedent that you're pretty sure you're going to use in your thesis. And remember, an attractive precedent is going to be one that, number one, is in your view successful, and number two, it's successful in terms of the issues that you're looking at. Now, a minimum relevant precedent would be it at least is the building type. So you'll at least be able to get smarter about the building type if you find a building type similar in type and in scale to the one that you're thinking about taking on. But an even better precedent is one that's the building type or close to it, and that has wrestled with the same issues or issues like the ones that you're wrestling with in your thesis, where that precedent's been driven by and shaped by themes that you're interested in. So you'll be learning at least 2 dimensions of lessons out of those. One is just general conventional design strategies that create a good one. And the other one is how did they embody, how did they manifest, how did they put in play the issues that you're working with in your thesis. So you're only going to do one of those. You're doing one literature review and one precedent study. Yeah.
The precedent study, should it just be in like an image, or should we...
I'm going to go over the pieces in it.
Okay.
So let's go over the pieces in each one of those things. Now, there's always a tension between me putting stuff up here and saying, here's the kind of stuff that's in there, and you being in charge of your thesis. So you can take what I'm going to do up here and deal with it over a whole range of treatments. One is you can just take it verbatim and say, sounds good to me, I'm going to use those categories. Or you can say, no, that's not quite what I want to do with a literature review or precedent study. I want to twist it this way, or I want to do this piece, or that piece that White put on the board really is not in play for me. So everything I do up here should be prefaced by take it as grist for the mill, make your own sense of it, but do appreciate the logic of why I'm saying it's a good idea to be treating these subtopics within each one of these chapter types. Okay, let's do the literature review first. This would be something that would happen for each one. First is obviously the title information. You're going to say what it is and the bibliographic information. The author, the date, the publication, location, all that stuff. So that's just kind of boilerplate data. Then I don't think it's a bad idea to say something about the relevance to the thesis. In other words, why was this attractive to you? Why is this in the literature review section? What makes it rise to being valuable enough to have a place in your thesis versus just being on the list and back in the bibliography? So this is speaking to, generally what does it treat, what does it talk about, and how does that relate to your thesis theme? Then an overview of the content. In general, what's in this thing? And you still haven't turned it at this point to its application to your thesis. You've talked about that here, but in the overview, you're just saying, here's generally what you're going to find in this book. And then you're going to focus on the applicable content. So what this is saying is a good literature review first talks about generally what the book is treating, and then you begin to zero in and pull out those kinds of issues and concepts and information that you are going to pay particular attention to harvesting and working with. Then you want to distill, if you can, useful lessons or principles. So you can almost think of this as a funnel. You know, first you start with an overview of the whole thing. Now we're going to concentrate on information that's particular interest to your thesis, and then you're going to get those drops of wisdom out of that you can maybe use as one-liners or even a more compact and dense narrative that's more directly useful in your thesis. And they can be concepts that are at work in your topic, or they could be ideas that are going to be applicable later on to your application. You should have an instinct for what you want to wring out of this as you process this down the funnel. So think of this as the final sort of drops of useful stuff that you've wrung out of this particular source here. And that would be what would be in the literature review for that particular piece. Now later on, let's say later on you've got 3, or let's say we've got 5 pieces of literature that you've reviewed. And in each case, they've ended with these principles or these distilled lessons. When you're done with your whole literature review, there ought to be some treatment or integration of all these things. So you don't end your literature review with just a separate stubbing out of the distilled principles. Your last operation, which would be after you reviewed all of your stuff, would be looking at what happens when you look at this thing as a set. Are there patterns? Are there emphases? Do these things keep hammering on the same point? Do they bunch up under important other categories? So this would be something that you won't do on any given one. It'll be something that you do when you're done with all of them. So this is not something that's going to happen for Monday. This is going to happen in your final literature review when you're done with all of your literature sources. And I don't have a feel for number of pages and words here. I think you should let this become what it needs to become. There's no page budget. To me, the emphasis should be on doing a good job and let the pages fall where they may. I would imagine that the narrative in each one of these things is probably going to be somewhat uneven. You're going to wind up saying more in some of these categories than others. Just let that be what it is also. And keep in mind, this is not a final thing. This is a draft. This is just a kind of a calisthenic and a warm-up to try one, so that you begin to get those skills and muscles in play and in shape, so that when you're ready, you can tackle the other ones as they come online. And what I'd recommend you do, if you're doing the one you're most confident is going to be in your literature review now, as you come across sources, and maybe you already have done that are also clearly in play, do it. Do the second one, do the third one, even though I'm not asking for it. You're in charge of the progress on this. So Once you take a crack at this and you're comfortable with the process, then you should feel free to go ahead and get this done at your own pace. Literature review ought to be something that's totally done, locked up, and final, as close to final as it can be at the end of the semester. This is not something that's going to wobble a lot, because you're basically taking stuff that's out there and picking it apart. And so this is, if there's any piece of the thesis that's not likely to be changed by subsequent thesis work, it's probably this. And that means this is something that you can proceed with just getting it done.
Does it have to be all text, or could it be?
It should be whatever's going to be useful for you. Yeah, and if you think harvesting images or diagrams or creating diagrams is going to make this more useful, I would do whatever needs to be done. What else comes up for you guys when you see this list? It's really pretty straightforward. You say what is, and then you start picking it apart for what you want to use. So it's really a basic kind of harvesting process and distillation process where you want to wind up with useful stuff. The reason why this is important is you don't want to just ramble about something and then move on to the next thing. Unless you squeeze this and make your mind go all the way to that point, unless you get that out of it, then you just sort of ramble through a book and stop rambling and go on to ramble with the next book. So this is trying to get you to see that the literature review really needs to be a squeezing and a distillation process. You really want to make your mind try to get to this point. So what other questions do you have about this? Is it clear enough? All right, let's go through the precedent thing. You'll see that the spirit of the precedent thing is not unlike the literature thing. In both cases, you're finding and taking apart something and distilling the useful aspects of it for future use in your thesis. So the only difference between the literature review and the precedent study is the precedent study is buildings and a book. So the precedent study is going to have all the name and data about it. Data being the name of the building, where it is, when it was built, who did it, the year, all that kind of stuff. You ought to have some commentary here too about the relevance to the thesis. In other words, why did you pick this building? What's so good about that? And then the basic information. This is really just sort of boilerplate stuff. This would be where you generally describe the building. The building's a ground-hugging, one-story scheme built of bricks in the foothills of Arkansas, whatever it is. So this is kind of a blurb about the building. Then you've got your images. And you want to choose buildings not only that are relevant to the thesis and successful designs in your view, but buildings for whom or for which there are a lot of good images. You can get a site plan, you can get a plan, you can get sections and elevations, you can get photos of the final building. You may find a really neat building, but it's too thin on the building information, and that's going to be a problem because you won't be able to distill much from it. And sometimes this winds up being a challenge, and you get sad because you've got this really juicy thing, and lo and behold, you can't get at the information that you need to render it useful in the thesis. So we got the images. Now we've got comments. So what was it about this building? Overall, you were intrigued by it. Now you're going to look at it more specifically. Was it the treatment of the roof, or their passive solar ideas, or their spatial arrangement, or their circulation, or their materiality? So like the literature review, now this is the overall thing. Now we're going to begin to come down and extract what it is about this building that you're especially interested in. Then we're going to distill useful lessons. So in both cases, the literature and the precedent, you're winding up with some final wisdom that you've extracted from this, that you have a hunch is going to be useful later on in your work. And also, like the literature search, let's say again we've got 5 precedents. Usually you've got 3 to 5. Less than 3 is probably too few, more than 5 maybe more than you need. By the way, the number of precedents that you have can be based upon buildings that are teaching you different kinds of lessons. So this building may have really done a good job with site, this did a great job with the technology, that did a great job with the whatever. All of those issues being in play with respect to your thesis theme.
So precedents have to be buildings? I mean, because considering if the application may not be a building, can we have the precedents be something else?
Give me an example.
For a painting, so if we were studying a particular movement, and as far as like there could be architectural principles within the painting, but it's still a painting. It's not
No, that'll be in your research and analysis, where you tackle your inspirations and do your transformations. This ought to be looking at your end game. What are you eventually going to apply this to?
So it's more about the typology as far as precedent?
Exactly. If you're looking at an art museum, these are museums.
Okay.
So your precedent studies are looking at your application. So there's got to be at least a decent match there. Yeah.
Well, if, I remember you talking about for our application when some people have made furniture. So they made furniture, would those be 5 different furniture?
Examples of furniture that have been expressive of some particular issue. Right. Those are good questions. The thing that you're talking about would be, and we'll talk about that another time, in the research and analysis part where you're working with, let's say, the raw material and issues out of which your primary wisdom is going to come, like surrealistic painting, sculpture, and writing. That's not the precedent study, that's the research and analysis section.
Okay.
So the next point is, let's say you've got X number of precedents. There's also going to be an integration of these lessons at the end. So like the literature, we don't want to just end with separate, independent sets of issues. When you're done with all your precedents, you ought to spend some time looking at how they all bounce off one another, how they relate, what the patterns are, and so forth. And then there's another operation that typically happens at the end of all the precedent studies that doesn't happen in the literature search. You guys have seen this, where you have your precedents, name, and maybe a photograph down one side, and you got this chart or matrix. And so in this band is all the information about that building, not this information. But across the top are your main thesis topics. So let's just say I'm mainly wrestling in my thesis with this, and this, and this. Those are my big chunks. These will often break themselves down into subtopics. Usually it's these subtopics which are here. So if this issue has 3, here's that issue, and here it's 3 subtopics. Here's that issue, and here it's subtopics. Here's that issue, and it's only got 1 topic. What this does now is it has you comment in the boxes on how that issue has been exemplified or brought into play within that building. This is another way of wringing these things out for usable wisdom. And so this forces you into a systematic treatment of your precedents in terms of your thesis themes. And then when you're done with that, you can see that this issue is going to be able to be summarized down here across all the buildings. This issue is going to be summarized down here. So the issues get summarized across the buildings. And the buildings get summarized across all the thesis topics. Usually you don't do this until you've finished all the independent separate precedent studies. So the precedent study has two gears. The first gear is you're doing them separately with this stuff. And then you're bringing them together. You could even say that this is the integration. So maybe the second thing is just this chart rather than commenting on the integration and then doing that. How you bring it together after you've done them separately is really up to you. Something needs to happen to congeal all this. Otherwise, what I said about the literature review is a problem with the precedents. You end with these stubbed out, unrelated lists, and you haven't brought them together anymore. You haven't looked at any sort of summary or integrated treatment of the lessons that you've learned from the precedents. And you may already know what these are. Sometimes you can't know what those are until you work a little bit more with your research and analysis, where you really push into your main thesis topics and realize that they're made up of these things. That's why you can go ahead and proceed with separate precedent studies and maybe wait to do this when you're clearer what those are. You don't really need to know what those are in order to do these things. So I want you to do a precedent study using these subcategories or something like them, in your own terms. Just do one. You're going to do one literature review, one precedent study for a week from today. And then that'll become the template for the way of working that can apply to your other literature review components and your other precedent studies. So, what questions do you have about this? Any others raise flags or issues when you think about what you've got to do and look at what the nature of the challenge is? Okay, so I'll look to see what those look like on a week from today. Now, the time we've got left, I want to move back into ways of working. We began to talk about that last time. We spent some time on the committee business. And I want to talk about some other things on this way of working list that I've got here. The next thing that I have that to me is really important, and actually this is probably a good board work too, there's some components here. The heading would be called Work Clean. It's important when you're navigating a process, whether you're doing a thesis or managing an architectural project or whatever it happens to be, whenever you're managing anything that's got any sort of moving parts and complexity to it, it's important to work clean. Now, what do I mean by work clean? It's real easy when you're in the heat of trying to progress with something to leave a wake of untidy stuff that you've got to go back and remember and tidy up and organize. And so what this is urging you to do is to try to work organized as you go. And there are several aspects of that. One is, if you can, type as you go. In other words, if you're beginning to generate some narrative that might have begun with pencil and paper, if you're not working on the word processor, I'm advising you, even if a draft is rough and a think piece and it's not edited very carefully yet, try to produce word process forms of things as you go. So you're not building up this big pile of hand-done stuff that then you have to go back into and put it all on the computer at once. Now this may feel like it's slowing you down, but it's going to save you time in the long run, because it's going to try to keep the information in readable form. You won't go back and wonder what that note meant. And it also, if it's in the computer, is going to be much more readily edited, cleaned up, and moved where you need it to be. So you're poising the narrative to be tinkered with and modified as it needs to be done, and then actually bolted into the thesis itself. So one of the things that has to do with work clean is type as you go. Another one is to keep files. And I know you can have computer files, and you can store things in different places, and I think you do need computer files. But I think in addition to computer files, you need paper files. Whenever I'm working on something that's anything like a thesis, whether it's a research report or a study, whatever it happens to be, I like to have one of those metal racks with the hanging files. And as I come across things, let's say like a really good diagram, or some juicy quotes, or a piece of information that I know is going to be usable either indirectly by summarizing it or putting it directly in a thesis. I want to be able to harvest those things as I go. I don't want to be looking at a book and go, that's really good, let's keep going, because I don't want to get slowed down. Then I forget what page it was on. I forgot what chapter it was going to go in. So one thing that usually works pretty well is the files are named for the chapters in your thesis. And if you find something you think would be good in here or there or whatever, Xerox it, do whatever you've got to do, and put that piece of paper in here. Another thing sometimes that will get put in here are things that maybe you're not going to use directly in the thesis, but it's going to be useful information that you don't want to lose, or you want somebody to read your thesis later to be able to use, and it goes in your appendix. So when you find things that are harvestable and usable, get organized so that you've got some slots or files to put them in, and don't just let it be a pile that piles up. That's part of working clean too, is have places to put things as you find them. I would recommend you keep a journal. Now, why do I say that? Your minutes, your jotted minutes of committee meetings can go in here. You're going to have things that show up in your mind that are not officially part of what you're working on at the time. If you always have your journal, you can jot things down and not lose them. So it's a good way to harvest and not lose and forget important things. Maybe it's an idea for your design. Maybe it's a twist on the thesis topic. Maybe it's something you want to run by your chair. But keeping a journal, keeping notes on the side that are not officially part of your thesis, but they're part of the working documentation of your thesis, I think it's a really good idea. Or a diary is another name for it. Try to hang on to all your drafts. Date your drafts, even number your drafts. For example, if I have a file called literature search or introduction, whatever it happens to be, and I've taken a crack at it, even though it's incomplete and needs a lot of editing, I'll put a note on it, put the date on it, put it in there. That's my first draft for my introduction. Because sometimes you'll be proceeding through the layers of the drafts, as the chapter gets built up. And you may have back here left something behind that you didn't think was relevant. And lo and behold, you realize up here in the third draft, that stuff back there was relevant. So keeping a record of the history and evolution of your chapters is a good idea. That's what I mean by keeping copies of your drafts. I mentioned jotting notes in your committee meetings. You may believe that you're going to remember the important things, but the thesis is a pretty revved up, intense process, and I think it's more likely that you're going to forget things if you don't jot them down. And when I say minutes, I don't mean you have to type them up and give them to the committee, but just reaching over and jotting a word or two to remember an issue or a question, and then reviewing that later and consolidating your thinking about what happened in the meeting and what you're going to do about what was mentioned is a good idea. And so jotting things during the meeting with your committee, I'm recommending you do that. The files also relates to building your appendix material. So I had that there on my list as a separate thing. But if you keep files, you're going to draw from those files for a lot of different reasons as you package your thesis. So those are some things that I mean by working clean. You're managing a process that's got some complexity and it's got a lot of other people involved, and it's good practice for managing yourself and managing a process for when you get out, because you're going to be managing complex situations in offices as well. We talked about the committee before, we talked about the application before. Just a couple of little things that I've noticed in watching a lot of theses get done. Beware of the middle of the process. Almost everybody starts revved up. The process forces you to close strong. But the center of the project is where the danger of drift is, where you, for some reason, don't get something done every day. You don't touch the chapters often, and there starts to be lulls and gaps and slowdowns. If you look at the university calendar, when things start to be due, they begin to call for stuff somewhere around the middle of the spring semester. You really don't have all of spring to finish this. You've got to be closing the process closer to the middle of the spring than the end of the spring. And that means you've got to be efficient with your process, and you've got to jump on it this semester. So it's really like a race. You want to get out of the blocks fast and then keep steady pressure on the process, and then you've got to sprint home. So in a very real way, it's an athletic event. And you've got to pace yourself, make sure you're progressing every day, make sure you get something done on it every day. And I think it's also fair to say that we don't always feel like doing certain kind of things. Maybe one day you wake up and you're not feeling good. You really don't feel like writing, but you can do this. You can assemble your material for the president, so you do what you can do, rather than using some obstacle or feeling to cancel the day out altogether. So doing what you can do when you can is a good way to make sure there aren't those lulls. We're probably, I'm still working with Andrew on this. I know there's been precedents or templates for what kind of deliverables and shows and tells the thesis class is supposed to have in the fall and spring. My attitude is I don't want to require things that divert your attention from true progress and quality thinking on the thesis. But we probably will have at least 2 public progress reports, probably somewhere around the middle of the term and at the end of the term. Obviously, the end of the term you'll be further along and you'll be able to show more and say more. I don't know what the nature of that will be. It could be as simple as a display in the atrium and you standing around your stuff pinned up, some of which is finished, some of which is in progress, talking to faculty who want to talk with you. Or it could be a slideshow or a poster, whatever it is. I want to feel our way into that. I don't have a real sharp image of what that wants to be, other than the fact is I don't want to ask you to do things that are side trips and not in the trunk of the flow of doing the thesis. I want it to be stuff that is truly part of the flow of the thesis itself. So we'll probably talk together about that and what that wants to be. So all of this is to say, this semester you should be banking time and not mortgaging time. You know, you should be trying to get ahead because, as you know, life usually has more complications waiting for you than you thought it did. And so being efficient now, getting on with it, making sure that you progress every day, that's really important. Also, keep building your bibliography, even after your literature search, which ostensibly might make you think, well, I'm through with all that stuff. In the reality of the flow of the thesis, though, even though you may have finished, say, 3 to 5 literature pieces in your review, and in effect that chapter's done, you may still find something that's useful in your thinking later on. And it may still come into play during your research and analysis phase or during your application phase. So keep your search engine on. Keep your eye out for additional sources that might be useful even after you've officially maybe completed the literature search. Something that maybe it's a little too early to say now, but I'm going to say it anyway. It may mean something to you later on. I think it's important to be faithful to the process where it leads. All of you are starting out with certain kinds of hunches and things that you want to work on and work with. One of the essences of the master's project is to choose something and push into it. But there is a kind of an elegance and sincerity and authenticity and integrity to the logical unfoldment of the process. So what I'm saying here is the thesis doesn't challenge you to prove something. The thesis challenges you to investigate something. Even though you have a hunch at the beginning how this is liable to wind up and how you, at the beginning, think it might wind up. But it could be that once you immerse yourself in your topics, especially your research and analysis where you're doing your most critical thinking about your topic, you find out this thing is really 5 degrees off of that, or it's something else that you didn't expect. So what I'm saying is being true to the flow and where the information and where your thinking tends to be leading you, even though on first blush you go, you know what, that isn't really what I thought was going to happen here. Well, that isn't what I wanted to hear. The classic, which is that I use a lot in thesis classes, there was a guy named Brett Hammond many years ago, whose thesis was studying a little island off of Cedar Key called Atsina Odi. It had some ruins, historical ruins, I forget how far back they went. And his thesis was, first of all, historic preservation, but then how do you apply those principles to these ruins? How could he sensitively put an interpretive center on this island with these ruins? That was his application. And the more he studied, the more he realized he really shouldn't put anything on that island. He should leave it alone. So he wound up moving his site to the mainland and leaving the island alone. So that's a case of setting out, meaning to and intending to do this, and the more he looked at it, he realized that isn't what should happen here. But he didn't discover that until he had thought pretty deeply and pretty far along with his thesis process. So sometimes your findings are going to be surprising, and you just need to let them be that. And they can be even surprises like, you know what, it was never a good idea to look at this, apply to that, because I can't see a way to apply it. Or the applications of my thesis topic to my project are so limited and don't touch that many things that if I had to do it over, I would do this. That is still a success. That's still wisdom gleaned. That's still a journey taken. And that's what I mean by being faithful to the process. So be real in your own thinking and the privacy of your own mind. When you really know something is true, write it down, say it, and then decide what the next step is. Even though it's a side door opening or a trap door that you never expected to open, or a door that's closing that you thought was open. Say a couple of things about efficiency and effectiveness. This comes from management theory. Efficiency means doing things right. So if I have a task in front of me, efficiency means that I enter into this task and I get it done with minimal waste, minimal side trips, minimal wasted motion. That's efficiency, doing things right. Effectiveness is doing the right things. So effectiveness says which of these things should I pick up? What next thing should I be doing? So choosing the next thing to do is effectiveness. How well you do it is efficiency. And those two things are very much in play in the thesis passage. You're going to be honing your effectiveness muscles and your efficiency muscles. Obviously, effectiveness is strategic. What should you tackle next in your thesis flow? And then once you tackle something, how efficiently can you expedite that? So efficiency is tactical. Effectiveness is strategic. That's probably a good ending point. So let's end there. I'll keep you guys appraised of the faculty who have accepted so far. Roy Knight and Mike Alfano have said yes. But invitations are out to everybody else. I'm hoping there are no scheduling conflicts that are just going to ace somebody out. I won't know that for a while. Okay, so see you guys on Wednesday.